Hello everybody, my name is Jim Pingle and welcome to our August 2017 Hangout. This month we're going to be talking about backup and restore on pfSense 2.4. About this Hangout, this month we've got project news, and then we'll talk about how pfSense stores its settings in a central configuration file, why you might want to reinstall for 2.4 or why you might have to reinstall for 2.4, how to make a backup from the GUI, how to restore from the GUI, how the restore process works, things to watch out for when you're restoring to different hardware, using the configuration history in the GUI, some of the existing options that are a little bit better in 2.4 installer to recover or restore a configuration during the installation process, how to manually edit the config XML file, talk about auto config backup, and some other backup techniques that are out there as well. First up in the project news, 2.4.0 release candidate is out if you haven't seen the news yet. So we've got a post on our blog about it. Oh, that URL's wrong. It should just be www.netgate.com. I'll get that fixed before I upload the slides. There's also the release notes that are up on the doc wiki. Link is under there. The 2.4.0 release should be pretty soon. How fast that comes out depends on what gets found during the release candidate process and testing and things like that. So far it's been pretty smooth. We found a couple of things we've had to fix already. There's a couple of things still pending, but it should be pretty soon. Another thing of note, if you haven't been paying attention to the 2.4 news that's been going around, 2.4 does not have any support for 32-bit x86 systems and no support for NanoBSD, so it's just full installs on 64-bit hardware plus our ARM platforms. All right, it's 2.4 has its FreeBSD 11.0 base. And we're going to be following this up with a 2.4.1 release with based on FreeBSD 11.1, but we wanted to get 2.4 out there, so we didn't want to hold 2.4 back anymore as we rebase to yet another different FreeBSD version. So we wanted to get all that in line so we could get this out, and then we wouldn't have as much time pressure to get 11.1 tested. Some early test images are very promising, but we need to give it a little bit more time. So if you're tracking the snapshots for 2.4, you want to make sure your firewall is set to stable in the update settings, otherwise it'll skip right ahead to the 2.4.1 images, so you won't get to RC or release. If you're unstable, it'll go to the RC and then eventually to release as you track it. And if you're on 2.3, you can pick 2.4 from the update settings and it'll update you to the release candidate as well. Another bit of news, we got pfSense firewalls are now available on AWS GovCloud. So if you're a government agency or you work for one or one of their customers, you know, it's another region in AWS where you could run our images, our AMIs. Their GovCloud stuff is geared more towards sensitive unclassified workloads. It has regulatory compliance settings and everything in there for things like ITAR and whatever. Basically, though, if you need it, you probably already know what GovCloud is. So you can go ahead and read through the press release and check that out. We also now have a free 30-day trial on AWS for our 2.3.4 AMI. After the 30-day trial, it converts to a paid instance. But if you want to try it out for free, you're welcome to. And then if you don't like it, you can always kill the instance. We have some more information on what's going to be coming in pfSense 3.0. Jim Thompson posted on Reddit about it. You can follow that link and find that in the Reddit thread. We also have an FRR package available now for pfSense 2.4 for routing protocols for BGP, OSPF, and OSPF6, all done in the GUI. It's intended as a replacement for both Quagga and OpenBGPD. If it works out, it's still kind of in a testing phase right now. There's still a little bit more work left to do on it, but if it works out and keeps working well, we're going to try to bring that back to the 2.3 train as well. We also have a 2.4 translation effort still ongoing. I think we're up to 13 languages. If not, we might have added another one since I checked the total. As they cross 75% of a language translated, we add them into the GUI. So for 2.4, so we have over 300 translators already. But if you know a couple languages, you might check over the list, see what's missing out there, and hack away on it. We also do have a new pfSense Supplementals 1 Advanced Topics course. and that's covering a few things that aren't in the base course with a little bit more detail. So if you're looking to expand into, I think, some packages, I can't remember the syllabus off the top of my head, but I know it's like snort and stuff like that. So if you're interested in the advanced topics, give that link a click and sign up for one of the courses. Oh, somebody had a couple of notes. One of my units wanted 241 dev instead of 244 RC. Is there a way to get to 244 RC without reinstall? Yeah, follow the link Clayton gave you in the forum. There's a way you can do that. At the moment, the branches are so close that it won't hurt you to force the packages back over to RC. Once they diverge a little bit more, that might be a little trickier or a little bit less advisable, but you can always you can do that right now and it won't hurt you too much. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about how pfSense stores the settings in its config file. So all the configuration data for pfSense and the packages, it's all held in one file, /cf/conf/config.xml. You can also get to it through /conf/config.xml. The CF is kind of a leftover that may disappear. It's more used as a mount point back in the days of NanoBSD and things which aren't around anymore. So eventually that may change, but you can always get to it through cfconf, but /conf works as well. So that one file contains an XML representation of all the configuration data and settings. It's a plain text file. You can open in any, or not any, but most text editors, browsers, XML viewers, and so on. You can usually open it up, and most of it's human readable. There's some things that are encoded that can't be represented directly in XML. But for the most part, if you open it up in like Notepad++ or Kate, Vi, whatever, you're going to be able to read through the configuration pretty easily. Using that one file, you can fully restore a firewall back to an operational state. So you can just take that one backup file and restore it and get everything back up and running. So you don't need to have a full disk or other file system backups. I know some people still insist on them, but for the most part, for 99.99999% of people, you're not going to need it. Just the one config file is enough. But the topic, what we're going over today, is how there are several ways you can back up that file and restore it. But you do need to be careful with that file because it does contain sensitive data. Things like certificates and passwords and other important information are in that file, and they have to be stored in a reversible format. So there are some things that you may not be able to read them directly, but it's a simple like base64 encoding where you can reverse it easily because the firewall needs to be able to use those passwords and certificates and keys in various places. Like for the web server, for the GUI, it needs a certificate. For your OpenVPN stuff, it needs these. For making outbound, PPPoE or VPN clients or DynDNS, things like that. It has to be able to read those passwords, and doing any kind of obfuscation on them is just going to do people a disservice. So we don't obscure them any more than we have to, just to make sure that we get that point home that you need to protect that file. It has sensitive data, and you need to treat it that way. So as such, you need to secure those backups appropriately. I don't know, it depends on your organization's policies and security best practices. So that may mean you have to store them on an encrypted drive somewhere or a special, a system that's offline. You may have to, do whatever your backup policies require for that. You do need to keep copies of the backup in safe places. I usually recommend keeping multiple backups, an on-site backup, an off-site backup, online, offline backups, so just make sure you've got several backups. And if you do have the capability, especially like if you've got an identical setup in a lab, you want to periodically test those backups and make sure they actually work. It's rare when something like that would go wrong, but anybody who's had to deal with a corrupted or unusable backup knows there are very few things that are worse than an unusable backup, because you've had this false sense of security that, oh yeah, we're fine. Then when the poo hits the fan, you find out your backups don't work, and that's awful. But rarely does that happen in pfSense, but better safe than sorry. So if you can, every once in a while, find a way to test it. Now, the config stores all the settings and things for packages, whatever that you've done in the GUI, but it does not support or back up any manual changes you might have made outside of pfSense. Say you edited a file on the drive, or you installed a package by hand from some other repo, or did something like that. It's not going to remember things like that. So you need to make sure that if you have made any modifications that are not a part of the base system, that you might have to take some other measures to back those up. Now there are a couple of packages I won't be covering today. There's one that lets you back up arbitrary files and directories that that you can use to work around that, but that's really a thing that very few people need, but it's there if you do need it. Okay, so you might find that in trying to get to 2.4, for whatever reason, you might have to reinstall. The major cases that we're going to see are if you are upgrading to 64-bit hardware, like you were on 32-bit hardware before, but now you're installing the 64-bit hardware, that's obviously going to take a fresh install on the new hardware. If you already have 64-bit hardware, but for one reason or another it was running a 32-bit version of pfSense, there's no supported upgrade path to go from 32 to 64. You have to reinstall. So you'd have to reinstall, the 2.4 image on there to get to 64-bit. If you had NanoBSD before, at the moment we don't have a way to upgrade from NanoBSD to a full install, so you would have to wipe and reload. We have a couple of things in mind for that, but at the moment we haven't been able to make it work in practice. But that's something we're looking at for the future. But at the moment, you're in for a reinstall. This is more of an option here. 2.4 has support for ZFS, and if you want to switch from UFS to ZFS, that also requires a reinstall, because there's no way to change your file system type from UFS to ZFS, in place the way the pfSense is structured. I know some other projects, like I think it's FreeNAS, has a way to do that, but it's a little bit more involved, and it's specific to how they run and the kind of hardware they run on that lets them do that. Basically, I think it involves like having a separate boot and data drives, and I don't know, there's some way they shuffle things around, but at the moment we don't have a way to do that. It's so simple to just reinstall with ZFS. It's almost not worth the effort to code around it. Using some of the techniques I'll show you today, you'll see just how easy it is to reinstall in place and keep your configuration. That it's just a couple of minutes and you'll be back up and running. Another reason is you might be upgrading to hardware that has an AES-NI capable CPU if you're preparing for pfSense 2.5, because pfSense 2.5 is going to require that, but that's still a ways off in the future. But if you're preparing for that, you may as well do that now. If you're already having to replace your hardware to go from 32 to 64-bit, you may as well make sure you get something that's future-proof. Another reason, you may just want to get a fresh start with a clean installation base or a new disk, especially if you were running, say, NanoBSD off a CF card or SD card. Now would be a good time to replace that CF or SD card, just to be on the safe side, because those things don't last forever. So it'd be a good idea to do that. So, but as a part of that reinstall process, backing up and restoring your configuration is key in getting back up and running quickly. So everything we're talking about today is just a way to make sure that you don't have a lot of downtime on a single firewall. All right, so let me back out a full screen here so we can see some of these things in action. All right, so if you're going to back up from the GUI, this is the most common way to do it. You just go to Diagnostics, Backup, Restore. You'll get the screen here. It's got sections for backup and restore. In most cases, all of the defaults are fine. You just click Download Configuration, and your browser it might prompt you where to save it, or it may save it automatically. If you only want to back up part of a configuration, like say you want to just back up, say, your aliases, and you want to restore those aliases to another firewall, or you just want to back up the aliases because you're going to make a bunch of changes, and if something goes wrong, you just want to be able to restore just your aliases, that kind of thing. Now, those backup areas, those partial backups, they cannot be restored to different versions of pfSense. So you can't take a backup of your aliases on 2.3 and expect those to cleanly import to 2.4. They may happen to by accident, but if we made some change to the format in an area from one version to another, the upgrade code can't run on a partial section. So So that's it's kind of dangerous to do. So if you're intending for a backup to cross versions, it's always got to be a full backup. This other option here, skip packages. If you check that box, then anything that's in a package configuration will be omitted from the configuration. And not just the records of the packages being installed, but all of their settings as well. So it could be useful, like say you had a bunch of packages and you don't use any of them anymore and you just want to make sure they're gone, you don't intend to ever use them again. You could check that box, make a backup, and then restore that backup, and it'll skip through, and it'll come back without any packages installed. Skip ROD data. If you want to do that, by default we don't back up the ROD data because it's gigantic. If you uncheck that box and then submit, it's going to back up that data in an architecture independent way, encode it and stuff it in the configuration. So you can take a backup with ROD data from a 32-bit installation and restore that to 64-bit and still keep your graph data if you want. So that's pretty good if you really are into keeping all of that data around and you really want to keep that history, you can do that. The last option here is for encryption. If you check that box, you can put in a password. You want to make sure that that is a password, obviously, that you have noted somewhere or can remember, because without it, you can't decrypt that backup. It uses AES-256 encryption performed with OpenSSL, and the command line I've got there, that's basically what gets run by the GUI when you do that. It does OpenSSL encode -E or encrypt -E, gives a cipher there, and it takes in the plain text configuration, outputs the encrypted, and it has your the encryption key there on the command. So after you've got all those options set, assuming you changed anything, or didn't change anything, whatever, you just click that button, and it'll save a copy with your changes, or with your desired options. And that's it for making a quick backup from the GUI. Really, for most people, all you do is hit this page, download, boom, you're done. I mean, just a couple of clicks, couple of seconds, and you've got a backup. Now, restoring it, not really that much trickier than doing a backup. You do want to make sure that when you restore, especially if you're restoring to different hardware, or if there's just anything that might possibly go wrong, better safe than sorry. Just make sure you have working console access before you start, whether that's a serial console, video console, whatever. Just make sure you got console access just to be on the safe side, though in most cases you won't need it, especially if you're doing a backup and restore of something that just came from the same firewall, same hardware, everything else. So you just go again to Diagnostics Backup Restore, to the lower section here where it says Restore. Now, if you backed up a partial configuration, you can pick an area to restore, but it has to be a partial backup. A partial backup is formatted in a special way. It's just got that particular area you selected of the configuration wrapped in a couple of pfSense XML tags, or an open and a close tag rather. Now, you can't take a complete configuration and just say you want to restore part of it. It has to be a partial there. Another important thing, when you're restoring across versions from like 2.3, if you're taking a 2.3 config going to 2.4, you can do that just fine. You can always restore any backup from an older version or the same version, obviously, of pfSense. So if you are on 2.4 now, you can restore a config from 2.3, 2.1, 1.23, whatever, and it will do all of the necessary updates it needs to bring that up to a current configuration. But if you're crossing versions, again, to reiterate, that requires a complete configuration, not a partial area. And it's also, if you're crossing versions, it's the best practices to make sure there were no installed packages in the backup. And I'll talk to you about how to edit those out in a bit. So when you're restoring a partial configuration there, obviously you pick that restore area, and then if you chose to encrypt your backup, you need to check encryption and put in your password here to restore it, and then click choose file to pick your backup. And how you pick your backup is going to vary based on your operating system. Windows is going to look different than Mac, is going to look different than Linux, or different browsers even are going to look different. So All you do is just choose the file, find your backup, and after you found it, click Restore Configuration. That will light up once you've got it selected. Like here, just let me hit that backup and see now it's a darker red and it's got the file name filled in. Not actually going to restore that one right now though. So a little bit about how this restore process works. When you feed a configuration file into the restore process, it puts it into place as /cf/conf/config.xml, and it replaces the running configuration with that config. It immediately checks if the interfaces match or not. If the interfaces don't match, it will give you an assignment prompt. So basically just like if you went to interfaces and assignments, and from there you have to check the interfaces, and not just the interfaces in the main list, but also like the VLAN tab and PPP tab and everything else, to make sure all of your physical assignments are adjusted in that case. Now you don't really, if you're just taking a backup and restoring to the same hardware, that's not a big concern. But if you're going to different hardware, it's bound to happen. So basically, check your VLANs, check your PPPs and everything in the other tabs. Make sure anything that refers to a physical interface is updated to the new interface. On the interface assignments tab, pick your appropriate assignments, and then you click save. It will apply some of those settings automatically in the background when you do that. So you might lose contact with the GUI. If you do, you might have to adjust your client IP address, whatever, to get back in. If all else fails, you can reboot it from the console or power cycle if nothing else. And it'll come back up with the new setting, with the new things. If you still do have access, click apply changes, it'll finish up and reboot on its own. If it doesn't, if the interfaces don't match or do match and everything is just fine, as soon as you restore, it will go ahead and reboot. It'll do a couple of things before it reboots though. If you fed a config in that had ROD data to the GUI restore, it will take that and it will read the encoded data back in. It'll write it back out in native format that ROD tool wants for your architecture, and then afterwards, after you've restored and rebooted and everything else, just check on your monitoring data, and if it's there and working, you're fine. If not, you may end up having to reset the data if it couldn't import it properly. But most cases it does, but in some cases, especially older cases, something in the file may have changed a little too much and it may not have been able to migrate that, but still, it's worth a shot. If you made any console changes, like if you change the primary console, the serial console speed, or password protected console, it applies all of those. That's something to note too. I'll mention it again later, but you need to be careful with restoring a configuration with different console settings. And again, packages, if you left packages in the configuration, it will not do anything with them immediately, but after the reboot, it'll go out and fetch those and reinstall them for you. And when it does boot back up, it does require internet connectivity, because if it has to, especially if it has to reinstall packages, it needs to go out there and fetch those. Although even if it doesn't have packages, it will still try to go out to the internet and fetch some package metadata and things. I think there's still an open bug about that. We're trying to make that a little better, but at the moment it's still a little rocky. So if you are switching hardware, going from one thing to another, you need to make sure that your console settings are correct. Some hardware forces the serial console on, it forces it to be the primary console, but if you restore a configuration with a different speed, the speed isn't forced. So for example, if you took a configuration from like an ALX or something that had a serial speed of 38,400 and restored that to like an SG4860, the BIOS on the 4860 is going to be coming out at 115.2, and then so you'd have one speed for the BIOS, another speed for that, and it might appear that it's not booting or anything, but it's really just outputting at a different speed. So you need to make sure you adjust your console appropriately, and then once you're back in the GUI, you can set that back to a good speed. Several times I mentioned this now. The best practice is to remove packages before taking a backup. Though if you're on the same version of pfSense, it's not that big a deal. Usually can handle that okay. Where it gets a little trickier is coming from something much older, like 2122 that used PBIs, or even before that used a completely different package format. Sometimes the package name may have changed over the years and it may have to leave something out. You may have to go and find it anyway. It's just usually safer all around to trim the packages out and then install that, or restore the backup without the packages, and then install them manually afterwards. Unless your hardware is very similar to your old hardware, you want to make sure any extra options you had enabled that were hardware specific get disabled. Like if you had AES-NI turned on before and it isn't your new hardware, you might want to unload that. Temperature monitoring, like if you switch from AMD to Intel or Intel to AMD, you might have a different temperature monitor selected. Generally, those are not harmless. If the driver's loaded and it doesn't find the hardware, it just won't attach. But still, better safe than sorry. And those are just a couple of handy examples. There are other, settings specific to network cards and things that might need adjusting as well. So if you do have to reassign, just be careful to adjust your VLANs and PPP interfaces and others. Don't just look at the first screen, because if you have others, they'll need adjusted too, and it will still land you in a reassignment screen. And also, watch out for other after effects of changing hardware, because it's new hardware. It's going to have new MAC addresses on your NICs unless you spoofed them. So you have to worry about things like ARP caches and upstream and downstream gear. You may have to power off and back on a cable modem that you're connected to. You may have to reboot switches, things like that. So they'll pick up the new MAC address of your firewall. All right, so let's look at the configuration history now. And that's over here. It's under Diagnostics and Backup Restore, just like the other stuff. And then you got the Config History tab here. And by default, it keeps the last 30 backups, but you can change that using the options here. I've got this one set to 100, but I just reinstalled this, so it only has a handful of configurations. It shows you the total current space used by your backups, which is just the size of all of them combined. And it's pretty handy to have these, but don't rely on them too much because they are on the firewall itself. It's great for backing out of configurations that might have broken something, but it's not great if your hardware itself breaks, because they're all on the firewall. If the drive goes, all your backups are gone. So they're a great resource, but they are not to be relied on for your only source of configuration backups. And so in this list, you've got your day, that's the date the configuration was changed, the configuration version, the size of the configuration. It tries to describe changes to the configuration, not just what happened, but also who changed it. It shows you the username and the IP address where the settings were changed. So if you have that, if everybody's using the admin account, you won't be able to see who's doing what. But if you have a different user for every admin, then you'll be able to see who made the change and where they made it from. It's got these action buttons over here. This refresh button action will revert back to that configuration. Now it doesn't reboot, so if you revert back to an older configuration, you'll still have to go like into a section that changed and either save and apply, or you could manually reboot to make sure it all happens. You can download one of these backups. Like if you just want to grab a backup of a previous step, you can do that. Or you can delete a backup that you know is bad. Like say you made a change that really broke something, you back out of it. You don't want anyone to come in there and see that backup. You can trash it so nobody tries to restore it accidentally. You can do you can see the difference between different configurations here. Like there's not really anything too exciting here. Let me go make a quick change to an alias or something. Let's see, I'll just change that description there. Now if I go back into the configuration history, you can see it shows that I edited a firewall alias, and if this left-hand column, I pick the older configuration, and the right-hand column of radio buttons, I pick the newer one, and then I click this diff button, and it will show me exactly what changed. The red means a line was removed, the green means a line was added. You can see in the detail of this particular alias, it removed that description and added the new set of descriptions, and it also updated the revision block down here. So you can diff from like the oldest to the newest, or just look at a couple things, and so you can use that to track down some pretty interesting stuff over time. You can also get to this configuration history from the console if you use option 15. You can then use option 1 to list the backups, and then you can use option 2. It'll ask you for a number, and then you can put in the number from this first column here of which one to restore. So if I wanted to step back to like number 12, I could just enter number 12, and then it would go back to that. So pretty handy all around. Now, there's a couple of things you can do to restore. The best one that I like to use is this recover config XML in 2.4. I use this all the time when testing. It can be useful in production stuff too, especially if you're reinstalling in place going from like 2.3 to 2.4 or from maybe an early version of 2.4 up to a current version. I'll show you how this works. Let me pop in a USB drive. What this does is it's used for recovering an installation on the same disk. Now you saw I've been clicking around this firewall. It's got a configuration. It's got my Acme cert and all kinds of packages and other fun stuff in it. I'm going to reboot with this in place here. We'll keep talking while it goes. What it does, it's an option in the 2.4 installer that it lets you pick a drive that has an existing pfSense installation on it, and it will try to repair that if necessary, and then mount that partition and look for a config XML file on it. It supports UFS and ZFS, so it's good for older installations as well as installations on 2.4 with ZFS. And if it finds that configuration, it copies it to the installation drive after it's wiped. So I'll just let this keep going while I talk here. There's also another option. I'm not going to show you this one today, but it's the automatically restore from USB during install, which was formerly known as a PFI installation. What you do is you have a thumb drive. It's DOS formatted, like FAT16 or FAT32. It's different from the installation media. So you'd have two thumb drives plugged in, one with the installer, one DOS formatted with this config on it. The configuration file has to be named config.xml, and you have to place it in the /conf directory. So for example, on a Windows system, that would be j:/conf/config.xml. That thumb drive has to be connected throughout the entire installation process, but at the end, you'll have to remove them both. So it's similar to the other one. While it's running, it tries to find the configuration on the drive, and if it does, it kind of slipstreams it there into the installation. All right. Now, the downside of both of these, the console settings will take an additional reboot to fully apply. So if you change like the serial speed again, it won't show up on the first boot, but it will. The console settings get set up during that first boot, and then after another reboot, those would show up. All right, so let's try this out. Let me punch in xterm. All right, going back up to the recover, I'm going to choose recover config.xml. Now, my existing installation is ZFS, so it looks like both of those are the same thing. One's the actual disk name, another one is a label ID you can use. All right, so let's do that. And there it goes. It's recovered config XML, stored in temp recovered config. And it restarted the installer, so I have to put my terminal in again. Install. I'm going to go back to ZFS again. Now this I've got to tell it I want it to do a stripe with just one drive. I'm not going to change anything else because the defaults that work on this hardware otherwise. Yep. And we'll let that go. Another caveat about doing it this way, neither of these methods support restoring RRD data or encrypted configuration files, so it has to be plain text config and it can't have the RRD data. If you restore that with RRD, it's just going to be a lump there in the configuration. It'll never go away. That's something where I think there's an open bug for that too, but it's just something to look out for. Another thing, if there's an interface mismatch, it doesn't tell you right away. It will, on the first boot after, it'll do that. But since you're already connected to the console doing the installation, you're in a good position to fix that anyhow. So obviously, if you're doing the recover installation, it's coming from the same hardware to the same hardware in most cases, unless you moved a drive from one box to another. So it's not a huge concern there. but when you're doing the restore from a thumb drive, it's a little bit trickier. And in that case, you may want to edit the configuration and change the interfaces manually, which I'll talk about in a moment. Let's wait for this to finish. It's just wrapping up the installation, taking a moment. Do, 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 do. Well, I guess while that's finishing, I'll talk about manually editing the configuration. Now, it's not something you want to be doing all the time, but you can, open it up in a text editor and change the config. The place it comes into use the most is if you've got a bunch of interfaces. If you've got, say, you've got a bunch of VLANs or a bunch of interfaces, physical interfaces, a bunch of maybe PPPs or other stuff that are tied to physical interfaces. Well, I'd say VLANs are probably the biggest case because you could have installations that have dozens of VLANs and they all have references to the configuration. So, let me skip back to this. Let me go through there. Tell it to reboot. All right. Another big case is if you're trimming package data out of a config XML file. So there are package blocks that are used to denote package installations. And let me yank this thumb drive out there. And you might have to edit out things like duplicate or leftover menu service tab or plugin tags from older packages if they don't get removed properly. Usually it's not a problem if it's a current configuration, but if you're storing something really old and the package doesn't exist anymore, it may not be able to remove all of that properly, but you can check that out. I've got a config open over here while that installation's wrapping up. You do need to be careful not to break the XML format. And again, you can open it up in pretty much any text editor that would support Unix line endings, which is just about everything except plain Notepad in Windows. Notepad++ works, UltraEdit, Kate, Vim, Emacs, whatever, even things like EE or Pine, Pico, whatever. Yeah, not Pine, Pico, or Nano. And you can see it's all plain text. It's just got you can kind of guess what things are based on where they are, even if you're not terribly familiar with it. Just to show you the interfaces here, scrolling down a bit to get to interfaces and see WAN, see right there, F is IGB1. If I was changing from EM to IGB, that might say EM0, and I might just back that out and put IGB0, or something like that. And there's wireless and others. So interface names are right there, and that's all you'd want to change. Now, if we're looking for packages, you can search for bracket package and find that. Say that's got auto config backup and system patches. Say I did not want to restore with the system patches package installed. I can just highlight from the open package tag to the closed package tag for that block, delete it, save, and then restore that, and it's fine. If you don't want any packages, just delete these package blocks and you'll be all right. There's lots of other stuff in here. You see there's the service tags that denote services for a package. You might have to clean some of those up. Back up here, I thought I had here's the menu tags and things. Say you've got a menu for an old package that doesn't exist anymore, you might want to delete that out as well. So just things you can do like that, but you have to be sure you're deleting a whole block of XML at a time, or you don't leave a dangling tag or duplicate tags or anything like that. I mean, it'll yell at you in the GUI if you try to restore an invalid file, but it's not the best thing to try. If you're looking to do an automatic search and replace, don't just do it blindly. You need to check everything. Just as an example, say I was changing in this configuration, EM0, I can't just search and replace EM0. If you look, it's smack in the middle of my SSH keys that are encoded. If I were to blindly have changed that, it would have corrupted my SSH keys. So you need to make sure you look and only change things that are actually interfaces, like here, EM0 to IGB0, EM0 in just that part over to IGB0 there, and same with this one, EM1 to IGB1, that kind of thing. So just need to be careful what you're looking at. Oh, in the meantime, our installation finished and it's back up and running. You can see it's got my name there. and got to log in again, obviously, and it was regenerating my SSH keys, but otherwise, you see it's all back up and running. Of course, it chose to do that right at the wrong moment. And we got package manager, and it even reinstalled all of my packages. There we go. Moving along, talking about auto config backup. If you're listening to me now, obviously you're a gold subscriber, so you should have access to auto config backup as well. If you auto config backup automatically uploads an encrypted copy of your config XML to our servers on each change, and the backups are keyed off of your firewall host name. So every firewall has to have a unique host name. Just so, for example, here we've got our auto config backup. There's a master switch, enable, disable. There's your subscription username, which is your gold subscription username, not your email address. There's your password, which is your gold subscription portal password, the encryption password, which is the actual key used to encrypt the config, so you need to make sure you keep that safe, and I'll go over that again in a moment. Your restore over here, you can see it keeps the last 100 or so configurations per host name, and the number of host names you can have in there depends on your subscription status. Now, the downside to auto config backup is there's no bare metal restore method. You have to be online and able to access the auto config backup package. So you may have to install it, or install a new firmware, get it online, make sure you've got the package installed, plug in your username, password information, and then restore the rest of your configuration from that point. You can get this installed if you don't have it in your diagnostics menu. You can go to System Package Manager, install the package, and then go to Diagnostics and Auto Config Backup. Something else to make sure, this encryption password, if you lose this, then nobody can read these configurations. So you need to make sure you keep that safe somewhere. Whether you use a password manager or something, or you make it a password it needs to be something strong though, so don't use a weak password there. And something you might even consider keeping a local unencrypted backup copy somewhere. That way, if you had to, you could go into the configuration, look in the package data, find the password if you had to. Let's see, over here on the Restore tab, this works similar to the config history. It lists all of your backups for the host, and you can revert back to a configuration, view an information screen. The screen here shows you both the encrypted config, some metadata about it, like the revision reason and the date, time, and the hash of it. And it also has a decrypted copy. And you can go in here, select all, copy, paste, and then paste into a text editor and save it. It doesn't actually have a download file function at the moment. And you can see all my other host names are present in there. So any, and it warns you if you're looking at a different host, any firewall with this package and your credentials can see every other firewall on your account backup. Obviously, if they're encrypted using a different encryption key, then it can't read them, but there isn't any separation in there because everything under your account is yours. It wants you to be able to read those. So that is convenient though. If you have multiple firewalls and one of them goes down, you can use any other firewall to retrieve your backup. So it's handy to have that way. If you look at the Backup Now tab, you can enter a reason like, say, before reinstall, and then you hit backup, and then it'll show up in there. Actually, I've got it disabled at the moment, so it's not actually pushing out any updates, but it would show up there if it was enabled. And then you have a Stats tab over here that shows you all of your host names, how many backups are present for each host name, and then you can use the magnifying glass to look at those, or you can use the trash button to remove all of the backups for that host. Now, some of you on Gold, you might have, I think there's a 10 host limit or something like that. If you find it's not letting you add backups for a new firewall and you have one you don't use anymore, you might want to delete an old host to put a new host in there. But those limitations all vary by account. So That's it. There are a couple of other backup methods I want to mention. There's a way you can fetch using wget curl or curl. Um, it does require a multi-step process where it has to submit a login and get a CSRF token and submit the backup and to download it. That's all covered on the doc wiki because there's some scripting involved there that you have to account for. It's not terribly complicated, but it's also it's something you need to be aware of there. You could also pull or push with SCP. You can just copy it from /cf/conf/config.xml. You could copy it from a remote host SCPing to the firewall as like the root account or a different account, pulling that off. Or if you want to copy it from the firewall itself off to another host, you could do that. Though copying from the firewall off is a little bit less secure because you'd have to have a passphraseless key. If you want to automate that, I wouldn't recommend that. What I like to do locally, at least for my lab, I have my SSH keys plugged into all of my lab systems, and so I've got SSH agent on my workstation running, and so I've just got a batch script that just does an SCP of all of the config off all these different ones and saves it. Pretty easy to do. An SSH agent, I just typed up my key once, and then the rest of the time it remembers the key through the agent. So very simple, straightforward to do it that way. But again, a little tricky to automate if you're looking for an automated backup solution, unless you resort to something like storing your passwords or a key passphrase or something in your backup system or script, which you can do, but we don't like stored passwords, so we like to avoid things like that if possible. But if all else fails, autoconfig backup's where it's at. So that's the best way to do an automated backup. All right, so that's really all I have for today. I'm obviously open to any questions you guys might have. Anything else you want to see? I've got a few minutes left. I can go over things. We're trying to make it easier for people to get up to 2.4, especially if you have to reinstall. So we're wanting to push this info out there again so people have an easier time. Let's see, for backup restore purposes, is an SG8860 purchased 2 years ago going to be the same hardware-wise as an 8860 purchased for the next few months? Essentially, yeah. I think there might be some minor revisions of the board, something different, like the storage size might be different on it, but in terms of the network cards it has and anything that's relevant for backups, it's going to be identical. So, yeah, no worries there. All right. Any other questions? Or let's see. Know when factory install images will be available. Oh, for 2.4 RC. We have the ones up. The recovery images are up for the SG1000 on the portal, but I don't know if we have any copied out there for that. I mean, they're on the firmware server for under the beta software, but I don't know if they're actually publicly accessible there. I'll have to check on that. You can always upgrade in place, though. Let's see, have had issues with cloud backups failing due to blocking. Is there documentation regarding host names or such being used? The backups, they all go to portal.pfSense.org at the moment. That may change in the future, but it's just portal.pfSense.org for now. That host does have IPv4 and IPv6 connectivity, so you may need to check whatever comes back for the A and Quad A records if you're looking to go by host name. Now the IP address for that's not going to change very often, but it's still something that could change if we decide to relocate that to one of our other data centers. But for the moment, you can just look up portal.pfsense.org. You want to switch to ZFS? Yeah, that's a good reason. I'll check on that and see. I'm not sure if they're publicly accessible or if we need to copy the RCs up to the usual firmware site. So I know we just fixed that for the SG1000, but the others I don't think are quite done the same way yet. Let's see. Someone asking about news on the partner program. I don't have any information about the partner program. Sorry, you'd have to go through the sales or something like that. But if you have any concerns about how the partners and stuff are working, you can always drop a note to our sales guys and they can get it to the right place. All right. Well, I'm going to have to go ahead and call it there. Thank you all for attending, and we'll be back next month. If you have any suggestions for a topic, post on the forum or comment on Reddit or Twitter, whatever, just send them along. Thank you. See you next month. Bye.